The night I found her, I was barefoot and cold marble, holding a wine glass I'd stolen from his kitchen, and I could hear her breathing through a door that was supposed to be a wall. I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not a naive woman. I have a law degree. I have lived alone in 3 cities. I have trusted the wrong man before, but never like this. Never a man with motorcades and Senate hearings and a face on the side of campaign buses. And I need you to hear every single part of what I'm about to say, because the part that still destroys me isn't the missing girl. It's that I loved him, and I think, on some level, he knew exactly what I would do when I found her. My name is Claire. I was 31 years old. Freshly out of a 4-year relationship that had ended the way all bad relationships end. Slowly, then all at once. I had relocated from Chicago to Washington, D.C. for a job at a nonprofit doing policy research. Affordable housing, nothing glamorous. Long days, bad coffee, and the peculiar loneliness of a city where everyone is performing importance. I had not planned on meeting anyone. I had actually made a private rule. No dating for 1 year. Get your head right, Claire. Get stable. Get boring if you have to, but get settled. I broke that rule on a Tuesday night in October at a fundraising dinner I had been forced to attend by my director, wearing a dress I'd borrowed from my colleague Priya and shoes that were half a size too small. The dinner was at a historic estate in Georgetown. It's the kind of place that makes you feel like you've walked into a photograph from 1962. Crystal chandeliers, dark wood paneling, servers in white gloves, and at the center of it all, the man the evening was honoring, Senator Daniel Ashford, 2-term incumbent, bipartisan favorite, quietly rumored to be preparing a presidential run. I had seen his face on policy briefs. I had cited his housing legislation in 3 separate research papers. I had no interest in him as anything other than a useful name. And then he sat down next to me at dinner, not at the head table where he was supposed to be, but in the empty chair beside mine, at the far end of the room, where he clearly thought no one important would notice him. He leaned over and said quietly, "Is the salmon as bad as it looks, or is that just the lighting?" I laughed. And that was the beginning of everything. His name up close and in a bad suit jacket was nothing like his name on a billboard. He was warm, self-deprecating in a way that felt genuinely unperformed. He asked about my work, not politely, but with actual follow-up questions. When I mentioned a policy gap in rural housing subsidies that I'd been researching for 6 months, he said, "Have you published that? Because our committee has been stuck on that exact problem, and I think you'd infuriate our current consultant in the best possible way." He didn't ask for my number. He asked for my research notes. I should have found that professional. Instead, I found it attractive in a way I couldn't explain. We exchanged contact information under the pretense of policy collaboration. He emailed me the next morning, 7:42 a.m., which I noticed, asking if I'd be willing to meet his housing policy advisor. I said yes. We met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from my office. His advisor came for the first 20 minutes and then had an urgent call. Daniel, he'd insisted I call him Daniel, not Senator, stayed for 2.5 hours. We talked about everything: his upbringing in rural Virginia, his late father who'd worked in a steel mill and died before his first election, my mother's illness, The year I'd spent in a city I hated because I thought it was what I was supposed to want. He told me he was divorced 5 years prior, and that his daughter lived with her mother in Richmond, and that he drove down every other weekend without the motorcade because he wanted her to have a father, not a senator. That detail broke something open in me. I couldn't explain why. We began seeing each other in the careful, muted way that powerful people conduct their private lives. Dinners in small restaurants where the lighting was low and the tables were far apart. Long drives with no destination. Sunday afternoons in his Georgetown estate, which he called the house, with an embarrassed modesty that I found endearing, even though the house had 8 bedrooms and a garden designed by someone whose name I recognized from architecture magazines. He was attentive without being suffocating. He remembered things. The name of my sister's cat, the date of a presentation I'd mentioned offhandedly, that I couldn't sleep when it rained. He texted me at odd hours, not urgently, just there, as if he was thinking of me the way you think of something that has become part of your daily architecture. When 3 months in, I was in love with him. I hadn't said it, but it was there, settled and certain, the way winter settles, without announcement. And then, so gradually I almost didn't notice, certain doors in his house began to stay closed. The guest house was a separate structure at the back of the property. Stone and ivy. It looked like something out of an English countryside photograph. Daniel told me it had been built in the 1940s. Originally servants' quarters, later converted into a private retreat. He used it, he said, for work, for quiet. Sometimes his security detail used it. It was nothing. The first time I noticed anything, I was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of tea, watching the garden at dusk. A light went on in the guest house. Just a single window on the upper floor, pale yellow, and then off again after a few seconds. I thought nothing of it. Light timers, security sweep, nothing. The second time, I was walking the garden path at around 10 p.m. because I couldn't sleep. I passed close enough to the guest house to hear, or think I heard, something low and rhythmic coming from inside, a sound like someone pacing. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Back and forth across a small space. I stopped. I stood very still. The sound continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I told myself, old house, pipes, wind through a vent, the imagination of a woman who had been reading too much dark fiction before bed. But I started paying attention to the guest house in the way you pay attention to something you've decided to ignore, which means you can't actually stop noticing it. I noticed that Daniel's head of household staff, a reserved man named Gerald who had worked for him for 11 years, would not make eye contact with me when I asked about it. Not in a guilty way, in a trained way. The way someone looks when they've been told very specifically not to discuss something. I noticed that catering staff who came on the occasions Daniel hosted small dinners were never taken near the back of the property. There was always a subtle redirection, a closed gate, a reason to stay toward the front. I noticed that Daniel himself, whenever I came close to asking about it directly, had a way of shifting the entire emotional temperature of a room. A hand on my face, a question about my day, a kiss that arrived at precisely the moment I was about to speak. He was good at it. too good. And I would not understand why until it was almost too late. The news story broke on a Wednesday morning in February. A 16-year-old girl named Maya Torres had been missing for 8 weeks. She'd last been seen leaving her part-time job at a grocery store in Alexandria, Virginia. Her mother had been making rounds on local news. A small, exhausted woman with dark circles and a yellow ribbon pinned to her coat. Pleading for information, tips had gone cold. The case had the particular silence that settles around missing girls of color in this country when the cameras start to turn away. I remember seeing the news alert on my phone while I was at Daniel's house. I showed it to him. He looked at it for a long moment and said, "Terrible," in a voice that was measured and political. The voice he used for condolence statements, not the voice he used with me. But that wasn't what I noticed. What I noticed was his hands. His hands went still. Not in the way hands go still when you're thinking, in the way hands go still when you are making a very deliberate decision not to move. I watched him set my phone face down on the counter, without reading more. And then I watched him change the subject. Smoothly, naturally, completely. Within 30 seconds, we were talking about a restaurant in Annapolis. I let him lead me there. I smiled at the right moments. But something had shifted in the room, and I couldn't name it, and I couldn't unfeel it. 2 days later, I came to his house while he was on a Senate call that was running long. Gerald let me in. I walked through the main hallway toward the kitchen to make tea, and I passed the window that looked out toward the back garden. There was a tray on the ground outside the guest house door. A dinner tray with a plate cover, the kind hospitals use, the kind you use when you are delivering a meal to someone who cannot come and get it themselves. I wish I hadn't seen it. I wish I had just made my tea and gone back to the sitting room. Because what I did next, what I couldn't stop myself from doing, changed everything. I went outside. I walked across the garden in the cold February air, my hands in the pockets of my cardigan, telling myself I was just curious, just getting some air, just walking. The tray was there, barely touched, a bowl of soup, gone cold, a piece of bread, a glass of water with the ice long melted. I stood there looking at it for what felt like a very long time, and then I heard it. A sound from inside the guest house, not pacing this time, and a voice, low, hoarse, barely above a whisper, a single word repeated, "Help! I want to tell you that I acted immediately. I want to tell you I kicked the door in or called 911 right there in the garden in my cardigan with cold hands. But I didn't." I stood absolutely frozen for what I think was 30 seconds, maybe more, while my brain ran every alternative explanation it could manufacture. A television, a podcast, a staff member who had fallen, something innocent, something that made sense. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sound that came after. A small knock from inside, 3 taps. Slow, deliberate, like someone who had learned not to make noise and was using every bit of remaining courage to make that sound. I put my hand flat against the door. I said, "Hello?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. A long silence, then, Please don't tell him I talked." The voice was young, 16, 17 at most. It was so thin it sounded like it had been worn down to almost nothing. I said, "Who are you?" Another long silence, and then, "My name is Maya." The world did not tilt dramatically in that moment. That's what I want you to understand. The world stayed completely still. The garden was quiet. The house behind me had warm light in the kitchen window. Somewhere inside, the man I loved was still on his Senate call, probably pacing his study the way he did when a conversation went long, running a hand through his hair. And outside, 8 feet away from me, through a locked stone door, was the girl whose mother was on the news every morning with a yellow ribbon pinned to her coat. I wish I never discovered this. Not because it wasn't the right thing to find, but because of what it cost to know. I did not have my phone. I had left it on the kitchen counter. I had walked outside on impulse, and my phone was inside the house where Daniel was. I told Maya quietly through the door, "I am going to get you out. Do you hear me? I am going to get you out tonight, but I need you to stay quiet for a few more minutes." She said, "He has people everywhere." I walked back toward the house. I walked slowly, the way you walk when you know someone might be watching and you cannot afford to look like you know what you know. I went back in through the kitchen door. My phone was on the counter. Daniel's study was down the hall. The door was still closed. I could hear his voice through it, and the particular cadence of him managing a difficult person on the other end of a call. I picked up my phone. My hands were shaking. I opened my contacts. I scrolled to a name, a friend from law school, Marcus, who was now a federal prosecutor. I typed a message I had never imagined typing. Maya Torres, she's here. Georgetown address. Come now. Don't call. Come now. I sent it. I put the phone in my pocket. I turned on the kettle. And then Daniel's study door opened. He walked into the kitchen looking tired in the way he looked after long calls. Shoulders dropped, a slight loosening around the jaw. He saw me standing at the counter and he smiled. That particular smile he had only for me. Warm and a little private, like I was the thing at the end of a hard day. "Hey," he said, "I didn't hear you come in." "Gerald let me in," I said. Hey, my voice was perfectly steady. I have never been more terrified in my life. "You okay? You look pale." "Tired," I said. "Long week." He came to me. He put his hands on either side of my face the way he always did. He looked at me for a long moment with his careful, observant eyes. The eyes that had always made me feel seen. And I understood in that moment that those same eyes had been watching for exactly this. For the moment someone got too close. Marcus arrived 47 minutes later with 2 federal agents and a local detective. I know the exact time because I had been watching the clock on the kitchen microwave like it was the only fixed point in the universe. I had stayed in the kitchen. I had made 2 cups of tea. I had sat across from Daniel at the kitchen island, and I had talked. I don't even fully remember what about, while every nerve ending in my body screamed, and the minutes dragged like hours, and I kept my hand around my mug to hide that they were shaking. Daniel had noticed something was wrong. I could see it in the quality of his attention. It had shifted, become more precise, the way it shifted when he was in a negotiation he hadn't fully mapped yet. He asked me twice if I was sure I was all right. Both times I said yes. Both times he held my gaze for a beat too long. When the knock came at the front door, his face changed. Not dramatically, just a small collapse somewhere around the eyes, like a man who has been waiting for a particular moment for a very long time and has just heard it arrive. He looked at me. I looked at him. He said very quietly, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." Gerald opened the guest house with a key he had been holding for 4 months. The federal warrant was obtained in under an hour given the circumstances. Maya Torres was found inside, malnourished but alive, in a room that had been converted, with sickening care, into a private space. Books, a television, a small bathroom. The kind of comfortable prison that powerful men build when they want to tell themselves what they are doing is not what it is. She walked out into the cold night air, wrapped in a blanket one of the agents had brought. She was smaller than her photographs. She looked at me once as she passed, and I will carry that look for the rest of my life. What I found next changed everything about how I understood the man I had loved. Because as the agents moved through the house, they found 3 things in Daniel's private study: a private second phone, encrypted communication with at least 2 other men, whose names, when I later learned them, made me physically ill. Men of power, men of influence, men whose public faces were made of the same careful warmth as Daniel's. And a document, handwritten, which told me he'd known even paper trails could be hacked, that outlined what Maya knew and what, in his words, needed to be managed. He had not acted alone. He had never acted alone. They took him out through the front door. I stood in the hallway and watched it happen. He was calm. He was composed. He did not look at me as he passed. And somehow that was worse than anything. Worse than rage or pleading or denial. The composure told me he had a plan, that even now, even here, he was managing the situation. He was thinking 3 moves ahead. The man I had fallen in love with had never fully existed. What existed was an architecture of warmth, real in its details, real in its texture, real enough that I had built 4 months of my life inside it, without ever seeing the walls. He had remembered the name of my sister's cat and driven to Richmond without a motorcade and looked at me like I was the only fixed point in his world. And none of it had been enough to make him a different man in the dark. I sat on the kitchen floor after everyone had left, and I cried in the way you cry when the grief is so layered. You can't separate the loss of a person from the loss of the version of reality you thought you were living in. I was grieving him. I was grieving my own judgment. When I was grieving every moment I had stood in that garden and chosen to believe the explanation that caused me less pain. My colleague Priya drove to the house at 2 a.m. and sat on the kitchen floor with me. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "You found her, Claire. You got her out." I know I did, but I loved him, and I don't know what to do with that. It has been 7 months since that night. Daniel Ashford is awaiting federal trial. The charges are extensive. 2 other men have been indicted. A congressional investigation is ongoing. The yellow ribbon is off Maya Torres's mother's coat. I know because I have followed her quietly from a distance, wanting to know she is okay without inserting myself into a story that was never really mine. Maya is in therapy. She gave a statement. She is, by all accounts, extraordinary. I went back to work. I finished my research paper on rural housing subsidies. I sleep better than I did for a while. and then I don't sleep at all, and then I do again. Some nights I sit in my apartment and I think about the kitchen island where we used to have breakfast and the way he took his coffee, black, no sugar, and the way he'd look up from a newspaper with the particular quiet delight of a man who was genuinely happy you were there. And I ask myself the question that I have no answer for. How much of it was real? Not him. I know now who he is. I mean the feeling, the 4 months of believing I was known and chosen and seen by someone worth being known by. Was that real? Does it count? Can something that grew in contaminated soil still have been, in the moment of its growing, true? I don't know. I'm not sure I'll ever know. What I do know is this. The night I stood in that garden and chose to walk toward the sound instead of away from it, that was the most important decision of my life. And I made it in a cardigan with cold hands in the dark. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough. I need to know what you think, because this keeps me up at night. If you had been me, standing in that garden, having heard what I heard, would you have walked toward it? Or would you have gone back inside and chosen not to know? And here's the question that no one has been able to answer for me. Do you think Daniel ever actually loved me? Or was I just the closest someone like him could get to something real? Comment below, because I read every single one, and I think you might see this differently than I do. And right now, I need to hear that.